Alright, thank you for coming and listening to our paper. I'm Shannon Brincat from Griffith University.
And I'm Damian Gerber, formerly of the University of Queensland.
And we're going to discuss a bit about our paper, The Necessity of Dialectical Naturalism, Marcuse, Bookchin and Dialectics in the Midst of Ecological Crises, which is going to be or has been published in Antipode. So I guess what sort of our interests in writing this article were essentially a deep issue and problem running throughout political philosophy, and particularly acute in dialectical approaches, and that relates to the question of this perceived split between humanity and nature. The problem for me, I guess, was if dialectical analysis is to inquire into, have a proper ontological position in regards to things like interrelationality, interconnectivity, negation, flux, sublation, then this question of how the dialectician reflects upon nature and humanity bears, it's like a really important question. And if that's not as seen, if that mirrors the separation that we see in traditional approaches to the social sciences, then sort of dialectical approaches are failing at step one.
Yes, and we know that there is a concrete social and political basis to this failure that we've tried to convey and illuminate to some extent in our piece. And I suppose for me, and probably also for Shannon, this relates to the difficulties which even ostensibly radical thought has run up against when, particularly through the influence of orthodox Marxian categories, when it tries to conceptualize and articulate nature, and more broadly how even a revolutionary relationship between nature and humanity can be rethought and applied in terms of praxis. And I think our focus on some of the difficulties and even failures of Marcuse's approach really relate to the extent to which he became trapped in a very pessimistic technological determinism. But interestingly, and the dialectical point here has to be, I think, that this is not simply a failure of Marcuse, let alone the Frankfurt School, but that it relates to fundamental problems in the Marxist approach to nature itself. And those problems, while by no means an indictment of Marxism as a political project, point to a great number of inadequacies in the very orthodox Marxist concepts that really, in our view, what we try to convey in the paper, have to be rethought. And this is where social ecology, and by extension, its great forefather and theorist Murray Bookchin, that's where his ideas really, if you're looking at it from the perspective of just dialectical philosophy, from that very abstract perspective even, we can see that this becomes quite significant, and also for concrete social and political reasons, given the fate of Marxism politically in the 20th century.
Yeah, so initially this human nature split can also be seen traced, into Hegel, where he speaks about nature as the realm of contingency and unfreedom, and I think Marx definitely was light years ahead in terms of talking about humanism and as a naturalism. But given the weight of interpretation on, say, capital and the more materialist content of that, particularly as interpreted after Engels and sort of ossified in the problematic readings of Diamat, that subtlety there between, and that inextricable link between humanism and naturalism was most definitely lost. And so our article is partly trying to reconnect dialectical thought to that.
Yes, indeed. And so I guess we should probably also mention something about the Frankfurt School and its connection to Marcuse, and how they take up this sort of antagonism between nature and humanity, which is pregnant, perhaps not so much in the earlier Marxist humanism, but certainly in the later Marx, and the idea of this, that you meet with in various works like Volume 3 of Capital, this idea of humanity having to wrestle with nature, as this sort of indissoluble condition of technological development, and how that becomes problematic in Marcuse's inability rather to really engage with that assumption critically, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I guess sort of going back to that initial point that I was making about the process of dialectical thinking, and Marcuse sets this up very well at the start of, well, the second edition of Reason and Revolution, and particularly two of his ideas or concepts around dialectical thinking. So the power of negativity, which is his way of articulating this idea that dialectical thought can pierce through the veil of the real and look to the potentialities that are within that, and then he looks to those, what he calls determinate negation, which is essentially that an historical mode of analysis that looks to those factors, those push and pull factors that can actually make either the destruction of the existing order or the creation of an alternative order come about. And so whilst he highlights those as critical to dialectical thought, the problem is he actually doesn't actualize those through in his own process. So particularly with one-dimensional man, that thesis that sort of, in many ways reflects Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, this potential is lost in his analysis, and what we draw out in our critique of Marcuse is on this one point, is that he also succumbs to this sort of separation between human and nature.
Yes.
And technology prevails.
Yeah, and I think a point that I would probably like to extrapolate upon briefly, that we make in our paper, is how the dimension of first nature, which simply means, human biology, biological instincts, if you want to talk about it in the most simplistic terms, how that becomes captured, particularly in the later works of Marcuse, like One-Dimensional Man, for example, how this idea of this biological first nature, in Marcuse's view, becomes irretrievably captured within the late bourgeois category of the totally administered society and its technological apparatus, through the rise of mass culture. And you could look at more contemporary examples like the so-called social media, which is really in reality a kind of pseudo-socialization, which is completely mediated by the market, as we all know. But and it is still, and this is part of the reason why I think Marcuse is still so compelling for us, because we can, and Horkheimer and Adorno certainly, because we can see how this completely administered technological mediation of humanity has certainly persisted under late capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism, if you like. But at the same time, we know through what's happening in places like northern Syria and the struggles of the Kurds, what's happening with the Ignorados movement in Spain, many other parts of the world, there is this struggle against traditional political assumptions that is part of those radical democratic movements. And this is really pointing the way in a pragmatic sense to what we've tried to identify philosophically, namely that an alternative relationship between humanity and the Earth's ecosystems are by no means, and that relationship does not have to be an inherently antagonistic one, in a different form of society, with a different ethical basis, and a basis in perhaps something like municipal and neighbourhood direct democracy, that, for example, an alternative configuration of that relationship would be possible.